Picture this. It's September 9th, 1739, and you're a plantation owner sleeping peacefully in your bed, just 20 miles south of Charleston, South Carolina. The sun hasn't even risen yet. The air is thick and humid, carrying the smell of salt marsh and pine. Then you hear it, a sound that sends ice water through your veins. Drums, African drums, pounding a rhythm you've never heard before in this colony. Not the work songs you've grown accustomed to, not the spirituals sung in the quarters. This is something different, something martial, something that sounds like war. You stumble to your window, and what you see stops your heart. 60 enslaved men marching down the King's Highway, not running away, not hiding in the shadows, not slinking through the swamps like fugitives, marching, in formation, like soldiers, and they're armed. They've got your guns, your swords, your axes. They've broken into Hutchinson's store near the Stono River and seized every weapon they could find. Their leader, a man named Jemmy, holds a banner high above his head. They're chanting something in a language you don't understand. It sounds like a war cry. And they're not heading toward the swamps to hide. They're heading south, toward Spanish Florida, toward freedom. And they're killing every white person who tries to stop them. This isn't a slave rebellion in the way most people imagine one. This isn't desperate men grabbing pitchforks and hoping for the best. This is the Stono Rebellion, the largest and most organized slave uprising in the American colonies before the Revolution. Before this day ends, 24 white colonists will be dead. Their plantations will be burning. Dozens more enslaved people will join the march. And the colony of South Carolina will be shaken to its very foundation. The laws that emerge from this single day will define American slavery for the next 126 years. They will make the institution more brutal, more restrictive, and more terrifying than it had ever been before. But here's what the history books don't tell you. These men weren't desperate fugitives who snapped after one beating too many. They were Angolan warriors. Many of them had been soldiers in their homeland before they were captured and shipped across the Atlantic in chains. They had been trained in military tactics. They had experience in warfare. They knew how to fight in formation. They knew how to use European weapons. They had studied the muskets and swords of their captors and understood exactly how to turn those weapons against them. And they had a plan. A detailed, sophisticated plan that came within hours of succeeding. A plan that could have sparked a revolutionary war 36 years before the shots at Lexington and Concord. This is the story of the day enslaved Africans turned the tables on their oppressors, using the colonists' own weapons against them, and nearly escaped to freedom. This is the story of Jemmy and the warriors of Stono. To understand why Jemmy and his fellow warriors chose this exact moment to strike, you have to understand the powder keg that South Carolina had become by 1739. This wasn't just another British colony scratching out an existence on the edge of the wilderness. This was something unique in colonial America. This was a plantation economy built on a foundation of human misery and mathematical insanity. The numbers alone should have terrified every white colonist who bothered to think about them. In 1739, South Carolina had roughly 6,000 white inhabitants scattered across the coastal low country. The enslaved population? Nearly 40,000 souls. Let that sink in for a moment. That's a ratio of almost 7 to 1. 7 enslaved people for every free white person. In some coastal parishes where the rice plantations were concentrated, the ratio was even more extreme. 10 enslaved people for every white person, sometimes 15 to 1, sometimes 20 to 1. In certain areas, a white face was as rare as snow in July. Now, imagine you're a plantation owner sitting in your great house, surrounded by hundreds of people you've brutalized, people you've whipped, people you've separated from their families, people whose children you've sold away, people who outnumber you so dramatically that if they ever decided to rise up together, you wouldn't stand a chance. Your 20 muskets against their 200 strong arms. Your 10 overseers against their 500 workers who know every inch of your land better than you do. That's not paranoia. That's mathematics. And the white colonists knew it. They lived in constant, gnawing, sleepless fear. This fear shaped everything about South Carolina society. It shaped the architecture. Plantation houses were built like fortresses, with thick walls and few windows on the ground floor. It shaped the social calendar. White colonists clustered together on Sundays, never leaving their plantations unguarded if they could help it. It shaped the law. South Carolina had the harshest slave codes in British North America. Enslaved people couldn't learn to read, couldn't gather in groups without white supervision, couldn't leave plantations without written passes, couldn't blow horns or beat drums. Every one of these laws was born from fear. Fear that communication would lead to organization. Fear that organization would lead to rebellion. Fear that rebellion would mean death. But here's what made 1739 different from all the years before. A new element had entered the equation. A flame had been lit 300 miles to the south. Spain. Spanish Florida sat just beyond the southern border of British territory. St. Augustine was barely 300 miles from Charleston. And in 1733, the Spanish governor had issued a proclamation that changed everything. Any enslaved person who escaped from the British colonies and made it to Florida would be granted freedom. Not conditional freedom. Not indentured servitude by another name. Full, legal, permanent freedom. But the Spanish offer didn't stop there. Escaped enslaved people wouldn't just be free. They would be given land to farm. They would be allowed to bear arms. They would be permitted to form their own militia units, trained and equipped by the Spanish crown. They would become Spanish subjects with all the rights that entailed. It was the most radical policy anywhere in North America. Nothing like it existed anywhere in the British colonies. It was a beacon of hope shining in the darkness. The Spanish weren't being humanitarian, of course. They were being strategic. They understood that destabilizing the British colonies served Spanish interests. Every enslaved person who escaped was a worker the British lost and a potential soldier the Spanish gained. A buffer zone of loyal, armed, free, black settlers would defend Florida against British expansion far more effectively than Spanish troops alone ever could. It was cold, calculated geopolitics. But for enslaved people in South Carolina, the motives didn't matter. What mattered was the result. Freedom was possible. Freedom was real. Freedom was 300 miles south. Throughout the 1730s, enslaved people began disappearing from South Carolina plantations. Not in ones or twos. In groups. Sometimes small groups of 3 or 4. Sometimes larger groups of a dozen or more. They were making the dangerous journey south through hundreds of miles of swamps, forests, and hostile territory. They were dodging slave catchers and their dogs. They were following whispered directions passed from plantation to plantation. They were risking everything on routes marked by secret signs and hidden trails. And many of them were making it. They were actually making it to Florida and walking into freedom. The white colonists were furious. They sent armed parties into Florida to recapture their human property. They demanded the Spanish return the people who had escaped. They threatened war. The Spanish shrugged and refused. In fact, the Spanish were doing something even more provocative. They were building a settlement specifically for escaped enslaved people. They called it Gracia, Real de Santa Teresa de Mose, Fort Mose for short. It sat just 2 miles north of St. Augustine, and it was the first free black settlement in what would become the United States. The commander of Fort Mose was a man named Francisco Menendez. His story alone would make an incredible tale. Menendez had been born in Africa, somewhere in the Mandinka territories. He'd been captured, transported across the Atlantic, and enslaved in South Carolina. He'd labored on a plantation for years. Then he'd escaped. He'd made the journey south through the wilderness. He'd reached Florida. And now he was Captain Francisco Menendez, commander of a militia of 100 free black men, armed with Spanish muskets, wearing Spanish uniforms, defending Spanish territory. For enslaved people in South Carolina, Fort Mose wasn't just a place on a map. It was proof. Living, breathing, undeniable proof that freedom was possible. Proof that 300 miles south, black men could be soldiers. Black men could be landowners. Black men could be captains with authority over their own lives. That knowledge was more dangerous to the plantation system than any weapon. It spread through the slave quarters, like fire through dry grass, whispered from plantation to plantation, passed from parent to child, kept alive in hearts that the colonists assumed were broken. Then came the war. In October of 1739, just 1 month after the Stono Rebellion, Britain formally declared war on Spain. The colonists called it the War of Jenkins' Ear, named after a British sea captain named Robert Jenkins, who claimed Spanish coast guards had cut off his ear during a search of his vessel. He'd supposedly preserved the ear in a jar and showed it to Parliament. Whether the story was true or wildly exaggerated didn't matter. Britain wanted war with Spain, and Jenkins' ear provided the excuse. But for enslaved people in South Carolina, this war was something else entirely. This was opportunity. Pure, golden opportunity. When Britain and Spain went to war, South Carolina had to send militia companies south to fight. The colony's military strength was suddenly divided. Men who normally patrolled the roads at night were gone. Overseers who normally watched the fields with loaded muskets were marching toward Florida. The elaborate system of slave patrols that normally crisscrossed the colony was undermanned and overstretched. The plantations were exposed in ways they hadn't been for years. The enslaved population noticed everything. They watched. They waited. They counted the militia companies marching south. They noted which plantations had lost their overseers. They tracked the movements of the patrol routes. And they planned. Here's the part that historians often miss entirely. The people who would lead this rebellion weren't typical of the enslaved population in South Carolina. Many of them, including their leader Jemmy, were from the Kingdom of Congo, in what is now modern-day Angola. This is crucial to understanding everything that followed. The Kingdom of Congo was not some primitive tribal territory, as European colonizers like to imagine all of Africa. It was a sophisticated, centralized state that had existed for centuries. It had a monarchy, a nobility, a bureaucracy, and a standing army. The Congolese had been in contact with Portuguese traders and missionaries since the late 1400s. Many Congolese people were Catholics, converted by Portuguese priests. They knew European languages. They understood European technology. They understood European weapons. Most importantly, Congolese men had military training. The Kingdom of Congo had been fighting wars for generations. Wars against neighboring states. Wars against Portuguese colonizers who kept encroaching on their territory. Wars that required discipline, formation fighting, and tactical thinking. When these men were captured and transported across the Atlantic, they didn't forget their training. They didn't forget how to fight. They didn't forget how to organize. Many of the men who gathered at Stono River that September morning had been warriors in their former lives. They had held weapons before. They had fought in formations before. They had followed military orders before. They understood that freedom had to be won through organized force, not desperate individual action. They understood tactics. They understood strategy. And they understood something else. They understood that the perfect moment to strike was coming. Throughout the summer of 1739, something was brewing beneath the surface of South Carolina society. Enslaved people were having whispered conversations in the fields after the overseers looked away. They were passing messages between plantations using networks the white colonists never suspected existed. They were stockpiling small supplies here and there. And they were watching the calendar, waiting, planning. September 9th would be the perfect day to strike. Why Sunday? Because Sunday was the one day enslaved people were given a few hours of rest from their labor. Movement between plantations on a Sunday morning wouldn't be immediately suspicious. White families went to church on Sunday mornings, leaving plantations less guarded than usual. The overseers relaxed. The patrols were lighter. Sunday morning was the one window in the week when the chains loosened slightly. And September 9th was special for another reason. Yellow fever was raging through Charleston that summer. The disease had already killed hundreds of people in the city. Many white colonists had fled to the countryside or to the Sea Islands to escape the epidemic. Others were sick in their beds. The colonial government was distracted, trying to manage the public health crisis while simultaneously preparing for war with Spain. South Carolina was weaker and more vulnerable than it had been in years. Jemmy and his fellow conspirators made their plan. They would strike before dawn on Sunday, September 9th. They would seize weapons from Hutchinson's store near the Stono River. That store was known to have guns, powder, and shot. It was relatively isolated. It would be easy to take. Once they were armed, they would march south on the King's Highway in military formation. They would gather more people as they went, freeing enslaved people from every plantation they passed. They would kill any white person who tried to stop them. They would move fast. They would fight as a disciplined unit. And they would make it to Spanish Florida before the scattered militia could organize an effective response. It was a bold plan. It was a military plan. And it had a real chance of success. The Stono Bridge crosses a sluggish tidal river about 20 miles southwest of Charleston. Today, the area is suburban sprawl and strip malls. In 1739, it was the edge of civilization. Dense pine forests pressed in from every direction. Swampy lowlands stretched for miles, thick with cypress trees and Spanish moss. Plantations sat scattered along the King's Highway, the main road running south toward Savannah and eventually to Spanish Florida. Hutchinson's store sat near the bridge on the river. It was a trading post where plantation owners and overseers bought supplies: cloth, tools, salt, whiskey, and critically, it had guns. Any store serving a frontier community needed weapons for sale: muskets for hunting, powder and shot for protection, swords and axes for clearing land. Everything an armed rebellion would need. Before dawn on Sunday, September 9th, Jemmy and about 20 other men gathered in the darkness near the store. They weren't stumbling around in the dark like amateurs. They moved with purpose and coordination. This was a military operation, and they treated it as such. They had designated leaders. They had a plan of approach. They had assigned roles for the assault. They broke into Hutchinson's store and headed straight for the weapons. Muskets came off the walls. Powder horns were grabbed from the shelves. Shot was stuffed into pockets and pouches. Swords, axes, and knives were distributed to every man who needed one. Within minutes, 20 enslaved men had transformed into an armed fighting force. The two white shopkeepers, Robert Bathurst and a man named Gibbs, were inside when the rebels broke in. Maybe they were sleeping in a back room. Maybe they tried to resist. The details are lost to history. What we know is that the rebels killed them both. It wasn't personal. It was strategic. Dead men can't raise the alarm. Dead men can't write for help. Dead men can't identify the leaders of the rebellion later. Bathurst and Gibbs were the first casualties of the Stono Rebellion. With the weapons secured and potential witnesses eliminated, Jemmy did something remarkable. He didn't tell his men to scatter into the forest and run for the border as fast as they could. That's what most escaped enslaved people did. That's what the colonists expected. Run and hide, stay low, move at night, hope to slip past the patrols. Jemmy had a different vision. He organized his men into military formation. He had them form ranks like soldiers. He appointed lieutenants and squad leaders. Someone produced a drum, and another man began to beat it in a martial rhythm. A banner was unfurled. Maybe it was cloth they'd brought with them. Maybe it was something they improvised from materials in the store. The historical record doesn't say for certain, but there was a banner, and Jemmy held it high. Then they started marching south on the King's Highway. In formation. In step. Like a real army. As they marched, they chanted. Contemporary accounts say they were beating drums and calling out in their native language. They were shouting, "Liberty!" They were announcing themselves to the world. They wanted other enslaved people to hear them coming, to see them passing, to join them on the march to freedom. This wasn't a secret escape. This was an open rebellion, a public declaration of war against the institution of slavery. The psychological impact was devastating in both directions. For enslaved people working in the fields that Sunday morning, or gathered in their quarters for a rare moment of rest, the sight must have been electrifying beyond anything they had ever witnessed. 60 black men marching in military formation, armed with muskets and swords, free and fighting. It was like watching a prophecy come true, like seeing the impossible become possible right before their eyes. For white colonists who witnessed the march, it was their worst nightmare made flesh. Everything they had feared, everything they had tried to prevent with their passes and patrols and brutal punishments. The thing they dreaded every night when they lay in bed, surrounded by people they had enslaved and abused. It was happening. Right now. Right here. On the King's Highway. The rebels moved from plantation to plantation along the road, and at each stop, they made careful decisions. They weren't killing randomly. They weren't destroying without thought. They were being selective. They were targeting cruel masters, men who had been particularly brutal to the people they enslaved, men who had separated families, men who had beaten workers for minor offenses, men who had earned the hatred of everyone forced to labor under their authority. These men died. The rebels burned their houses. They destroyed their property. Justice, long delayed, was finally being delivered. But here's something that often gets lost in the historical accounts. Something that reveals these rebels as disciplined soldiers rather than a desperate mob. They showed discrimination. They spared lives when they judged those lives deserving of mercy. According to multiple contemporary sources, they spared the life of a tavern keeper named Wallace because he had a reputation for treating enslaved people with relative decency. He wasn't kind by modern standards. Nobody who participated in slavery was truly kind. But compared to the plantation owners who tortured and murdered with impunity, Wallace was different. And the rebels noticed. And they spared him. Think about that for a moment. In the middle of a violent uprising, in the heat and chaos of rebellion, with their lives on the line and their hearts pumping with adrenaline and fury, these men maintained enough discipline to spare the life of a man they deemed relatively decent. That's not a mob. That's a military unit following rules of engagement. That's soldiers making tactical and moral decisions under fire. At the Godfrey plantation, they killed the owner but spared the children. At Wallace's tavern, they deliberately chose not to attack. despite having every opportunity to do so. At one house, they encountered a man who had been hiding behind his door with a loaded musket. He surrendered rather than fight. They could have killed him. They let him live. They were making distinctions. They were following a code. They were executing a plan with discipline and purpose. As they moved south, their numbers grew with every mile. Enslaved people from the plantations they passed began to join the march, some enthusiastically, running toward the column with joy on their faces. Some reluctantly, afraid of what would happen to them if they didn't join, afraid of being left behind when the rebellion swept past. Some were armed by the rebels with weapons taken from the store or captured from dead colonists. Others joined with nothing but the clothes on their backs, trusting that freedom was worth any risk. By mid-morning, the rebel force had swollen from the original 20 to somewhere between 60 and 100 people. They were now a small army, not a guerrilla band hiding in the swamps. A column of soldiers marching openly down the main road, and they were making terrifyingly good progress. By 10 in the morning, they had covered 10 miles from their starting point at Hutchinson's store. They had killed more than 20 white colonists. They had burned 7 plantation houses. They had freed dozens of enslaved people, and they were still moving south with determination and purpose. At their current pace, covering 2 miles per hour, they would reach the Georgia border in less than 2 days, the Florida border in less than a week, Fort Mossy in perhaps 10 days. Freedom was within reach. They just had to keep marching. But here's where military history teaches us a hard lesson about the difference between successful initial operations and final victory. Speed and surprise can win the opening moves of any campaign, but they can't win the whole war by themselves. The rebels had one critical vulnerability that they hadn't fully accounted for. They assumed they had more time than they actually did. They assumed the alarm wouldn't spread as fast as it did. They assumed the militia couldn't organize as quickly as it would. And that assumption would cost them everything. Lieutenant Governor William Bull was not supposed to be on the King's Highway that Sunday morning. He had no reason to be traveling through that particular stretch of low country. He was supposed to be in Charleston, managing the colony's response to the yellow fever epidemic and preparing for the coming war with Spain. But Bull had spent Saturday night at a plantation south of the city, visiting friends or conducting business. On Sunday morning, he was riding back to Charleston with 4 companions, gentlemen on horseback taking the main road home. They were taking the King's Highway because it was the only major road, the same road the rebels were marching on, the same road that ran like a spine through the entire coastal low country. At around 10:30 in the morning, Bull and his party rounded a bend in the road. The trees opened up, the road stretched before them, and there they were, 60 to 100 armed black men marching in formation, drums beating a steady cadence, a banner flying above the column, weapons glinting in the September sunlight. For a split second, nobody moved. The scene must have frozen like a painting. Bull and his 4 companions on horseback, staring in disbelief. Jemmy at the head of his column, seeing 5 white men suddenly appear on the road ahead. The drum faltered. The chanting stopped. Everyone processed what they were seeing. Bull's party was 5 men on horseback, armed with nothing more than the pistols gentlemen carried for personal protection. The rebels were 100 strong, with muskets, swords, and axes. If the rebels had wanted to add 5 more bodies to their count, they could have done it easily. A volley of musket fire, a charge by the lead elements, 5 more dead colonists in 5 more seconds. But Bull didn't give them the chance to make that decision. Whatever else you might say about the man, his instincts in that moment were sharp. He didn't freeze. He didn't try to negotiate. He didn't ask questions. He wheeled his horse around so fast the animal probably stumbled. He dug his spurs into its flanks, and he rode north as hard as the horse could carry him. His 4 companions followed without hesitation. The rebels had a choice: chase Bull and his party to prevent them from raising the alarm, or let them go and keep marching south toward Florida. Chasing Bull would mean breaking formation, splitting the column, maybe losing men in a running fight through unfamiliar territory, maybe losing critical time while the main body waited. They chose to keep marching. Let the 5 men go. Maintain formation. Maintain momentum. Keep heading south toward freedom. It was a strategic decision, a reasonable decision given their priorities. But it was also a fatal mistake, because William Bull was not just some random plantation owner. He was the lieutenant governor of South Carolina, the second most powerful man in the colony, and he had just seen the rebellion with his own eyes. He knew its size, he knew its location, he knew which direction it was heading, and he was riding north with that information as fast as his horse could carry him. Bull rode straight to the nearest concentration of white colonists he could find, a church the Presbyterian meeting house where local planters and their families gathered for Sunday services. Services had just let out. The congregation was milling around outside, talking about the weather and the yellow fever and the coming war with Spain. Then Lieutenant Governor Bull came galloping up the road like death itself was chasing him. The words came tumbling out. Armed slave rebellion. Dozens of them. Maybe 100. Marching south on the King's Highway, killing every white person they encounter. Already murdered more than 20. Burning plantations. Need to stop them now. Right now. Before they reach the border. The reaction among the churchgoers was instant panic, but panic quickly hardened into something else. Fury. Cold, terrified, murderous fury. These were men who lived every day with the fear of slave rebellion gnawing at the back of their minds. Men who checked the locks on their doors every night. Men who slept with loaded pistols under their pillows. Now their worst fear had come true, and they wanted blood. They had horses at home. They had guns at home. They had experience as militiamen and Indian fighters. And they had rage. Rage at being afraid. Rage at the disruption of their Sunday morning. Rage at the enslaved people who had dared to rise up against their masters. Within 30 minutes, Bull had assembled a mounted militia force. Historical accounts vary on the exact number. Some sources say 20 men, others say 40. A few say as many as 100. But they agreed on the essential facts. These were experienced fighters, planters, and overseers who had grown up on horseback. Men who had fought in skirmishes before. Men who knew how to use their weapons. And they were angry beyond reason. They mounted up and rode south. They knew exactly where the rebels would be. There was only one road heading toward Florida. The King's Highway. The same road Bull had just fled up in terror. All they had to do was follow it south until they found the column. And when they found it, they intended to destroy it utterly. Meanwhile, Jemmy and his army had made another fateful decision. They had been marching for 6 hours. They had covered 15 miles. They had grown from 20 men to almost 100. They had achieved more than any slave rebellion in colonial American history. And they were exhausted. The morning's violence had taken its toll. The rapid march under the September sun had drained their energy. Some of the newer recruits had never marched in formation before. Some were women and children who had joined from the freed plantations. Some were elderly people who had been swept up in the movement. The original core of Angolan warriors was still strong, but the column as a whole was flagging. And there was something else. As they had passed through the plantations, they had found alcohol, rum, mostly. The colonists kept it in their storerooms. And someone had decided that a celebration was in order. They had won. They were free. They had defeated every white person who had tried to stop them. Surely they could stop for a while. Surely they could rest. Surely they could drink to their victory and then continue south in a few hours. It was a human decision. An understandable decision. These were people who had lived their entire lives in bondage. People who had been denied the simplest pleasures. People who had never been allowed to celebrate anything. Now they had won a battle. Now they were free. Now they had alcohol and time to enjoy it. The temptation to pause and savor the moment must have been overwhelming. So they stopped in a field near the Jacksonboro Ferry. They built fires. They beat their drums. They danced and sang and drank to their freedom. They celebrated the victory they believed they had won. It was the wrong decision. It gave their enemies time to catch up. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the mounted militia found the rebels in the field. The colonists had ridden hard for hours. They had pushed their horses to the limit, but their fury drove them faster than exhaustion could slow them. And now they had found their quarry. What happened next was a massacre, but not the kind the rebels had been conducting that morning. This was organized, deliberate, military slaughter. The militia had several critical advantages. They were mounted. They were fresh from their rest at the church. They were armed with firearms designed for colonial warfare. And they had the element of surprise. The rebels were on foot, tired from a 15-mile march, scattered across a field, and many of them were drunk. The colonists didn't give speeches. They didn't demand surrender. They didn't negotiate. They formed a line, charged into the field, and started killing. The battle was brutal, but brief. Some of the Angolan warriors tried to form a defensive line. They had military training. They knew how to face a cavalry charge. But they were too scattered, too tired, and too surprised to mount an effective resistance. The mounted colonists crashed into them, with pistols blazing and sabers slashing. Within minutes, the organized rebellion dissolved into chaos. Small groups tried to fight back. Individual warriors stood their ground and died, facing their enemies. But most of the rebels simply ran. They scattered into the swamps and forests that bordered the road. They disappeared into the wilderness. By the time the sun set, the main body of the rebellion was destroyed. Jemmy himself was captured and killed. Some accounts say he was beheaded on the spot. His head was mounted on a pike as a warning to others. 40 rebels lay dead in the field. Another 20 had been captured alive. Only a handful had escaped into the swamps. But the killing wasn't over. Not even close. The next morning, Monday, September 10th, the full weight of colonial South Carolina descended on the Stono River region. Militia companies that had been mustered throughout the night arrived from every direction. Hunting parties spread out through the swamps with dogs trained to track human beings. Every enslaved person in the region was suspect. Every black face was potentially an enemy. The colonists didn't distinguish between rebels and bystanders. They didn't conduct trials or investigations. They operated on a simple principle: terror. The enslaved population had dared to rise up. Now they would learn the price of rebellion in blood. Throughout Monday and into Tuesday, the hunting parties swept through the low country. They caught rebels hiding in the swamps. They caught people who had never participated in the rebellion but happened to be in the wrong place. They caught people who had been forced to march with the rebels against their will. It didn't matter. Everyone caught was killed. Many were tortured first. Their bodies were displayed along the King's Highway as warnings. The colonial authorities wanted to send a message that would echo for generations. They wanted every enslaved person in South Carolina to see what happened to those who resisted. They wanted the terror to sink deep into hearts and minds. They wanted rebellion to become unthinkable. In the end, the death toll was staggering. Approximately 25 white colonists died during the rebellion itself. Around 60 enslaved people died in the fighting, or were captured and killed. Another 30 or so were hunted down over the following weeks and executed. The bodies hung from trees along the roads for months, rotting in the subtropical sun, serving as permanent reminders of the price of freedom. But even that wasn't the end of it. A few rebels had escaped the initial massacre and the subsequent hunts. They made it into the deep swamps and disappeared. Over the following months, small groups of survivors tried to continue the march south. Some were caught and killed. Some simply vanished, their fates unknown to history. There is one remarkable footnote. Nearly a week after the main battle, a group of about 30 rebels was discovered still moving south. They had somehow evaded the hunting parties. They had survived in the swamps on whatever they could find. They were still trying to reach Florida. When the militia finally cornered them, they fought. They refused to surrender. They died with weapons in their hands, still reaching toward the freedom they had never achieved. The last known killing related to the Stono Rebellion occurred more than 3 years later, in 1742. A suspected participant who had escaped the initial hunts was finally captured and executed. The shadow of Stono stretched across years and miles. The Stono Rebellion terrified the white colonists of South Carolina in ways that changed everything about the colony. For the planter class, September 9th, 1739 became a date of infamy. A day that proved their worst fears were justified. A day that demanded a response of overwhelming brutality to ensure such a thing never happened again. Within months of the rebellion, the South Carolina Colonial Assembly passed the Negro Act of 1740. It was the most comprehensive and brutal slave code in British North American history, and it would serve as a model for other colonies for generations. The Negro Act touched every aspect of enslaved life. It stripped away what few remnants of humanity the earlier laws had preserved. It transformed the enslaved population from human beings into property that happened to breathe. Under the new law, enslaved people were forbidden to learn to read or write. This seems obvious now, but before Stono, literacy restrictions had been inconsistent. Some enslaved people had learned to read. Some had access to books and newspapers. The rebels had communicated and coordinated. The new law made education a crime. Any enslaved person caught with a book could be killed. Any white person who taught an enslaved person to read could be fined and jailed. The law restricted assembly. Enslaved people could not gather in groups of more than 7 without white supervision present. No more meetings at night. No more gatherings in the slave quarters. No more communication that white eyes couldn't observe. The networks that had made the rebellion possible were now explicitly illegal. The law restricted movement. Enslaved people needed written passes to travel beyond their plantations. The passes had to specify where they were going, why, and when they would return. Anyone caught without a pass could be whipped, branded, or killed, depending on the circumstances. The law restricted cultural expression. Drums were banned. African languages were discouraged. Traditional clothing was forbidden. The colonists had seen the rebels marching to the beat of African drums, carrying banners, chanting in their native tongues. They understood that cultural identity and military discipline were connected. Destroy the culture, they reasoned, and you destroy the capacity for organized resistance. The law established a permanent system of slave patrols. White men were required to serve on regular patrol duty, riding through the countryside at night, checking passes, inspecting slave quarters, watching for any sign of communication or organization. The patrols had authority to enter any plantation at any time. They had authority to whip any enslaved person they encountered. They had authority to kill anyone who resisted. The law even restricted what could be grown. Rice cultivation was limited because it required too many enslaved workers concentrated in one place. The colonists remembered that the Stono region, with its dense concentration of rice plantations and majority enslaved population, had been the center of the rebellion. Spreading out the enslaved population would make future coordination more difficult. These laws weren't just words on paper. They were enforced with brutal consistency for the next 125 years. Every restriction, every punishment, every patrol route could be traced back to that September morning when 60 Angolan warriors seized their freedom and marched toward Florida. The Stono Rebellion didn't end slavery. It made slavery worse, crueler, more systematic, more terrifying. But here's the other side of that terrible legacy. The Stono Rebellion also proved that resistance was possible, that the system was not invincible. That courage and organization could shake the foundations of white supremacy even if they couldn't topple it entirely. For generations of enslaved people who came after, the story of Stono was whispered in the quarters, not as a tale of defeat, but as a tale of courage. 60 men had risen up. They had killed their oppressors. They had marched toward freedom. They had died on their feet rather than live on their knees. That story had power. That story kept hope alive in hearts that the slave codes tried to crush. The white colonists understood this too, which is why they tried so hard to suppress the story. They didn't want the rebellion remembered. They didn't want it celebrated. They didn't want future generations of enslaved people to know that their ancestors had fought back. But you can't suppress a story that powerful. It survives. It endures. It waits for the right moment to inspire again. In the longer arc of American history, the Stono Rebellion connects to a line of resistance that stretches across centuries. Jemmy and his warriors were followed by Gabriel Prosser in 1800, by Denmark Vesey in 1822, by Nat Turner in 1831, by Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad, by the enslaved people who fled to Union lines during the Civil War and turned themselves into soldiers for their own liberation. Each of these acts of resistance drew on the memory of those who had resisted before. Each proved that the human spirit cannot be permanently enslaved. Each demonstrated that people will risk everything for freedom, no matter how long the odds or how brutal the consequences. The Stono Rebellion also had immediate strategic consequences that shaped the colonial period. The massive military response to the rebellion stripped South Carolina of troops right when they were needed for the war against Spain. The planned expedition against St. Augustine, which might have destroyed Fort Mose and eliminated the beacon of freedom that had inspired the rebellion, had to be delayed. When it finally launched in 1740, it failed partly because of the resources that had been diverted to internal security. The Spanish continued to welcome escaped enslaved people. Fort Mose continued to stand. The promise of freedom in Florida continued to draw people south. The Stono Rebellion had failed to achieve its immediate goal, but the conditions that had created it persisted for decades. Standing at the site of the Stono Rebellion today, it's hard to picture what happened there. The King's Highway is now a modern road. The plantations are gone, replaced by suburbs and shopping centers. The Stono River still flows sluggishly toward the sea, but everything else has changed. There's a historical marker now. It was placed in 1739. Actually, let me correct that. The marker was placed in the 20th century, more than 200 years after the rebellion. For most of American history, nobody wanted to remember what happened at Stono. The white establishment wanted the rebellion forgotten. The story was too dangerous, too inspiring, too threatening to the order they had built on human bondage. But history doesn't stay buried forever. The Stono Rebellion has slowly emerged from obscurity over the past few decades. Historians have reconstructed the events. Scholars have analyzed the rebellion's causes and consequences. Communities have begun to commemorate the courage of the rebels. What lessons does Stono teach us today? First, it teaches us that resistance has always been part of the American story. From the very beginning, people fought against injustice. They didn't wait for enlightened whites to grant them freedom. They didn't accept that slavery was their permanent condition. They organized. They planned. They struck. They proved that the oppressed are never as powerless as their oppressors believe. Second, it teaches us that the systems of oppression in American history were not accidents or natural developments. They were conscious choices. The brutal slave codes that followed Stono were designed and implemented by human beings who understood exactly what they were doing. They were trying to crush resistance. They were trying to make rebellion impossible. They were engineering a system of control that would last for generations. Slavery didn't just happen. It was constructed, maintained, and defended with deliberate violence. Third, it teaches us that courage can fail and still matter. Jemmy and his warriors didn't reach Florida. They didn't achieve their immediate goal. Most of them died horrible deaths. By any practical measure, the Stono Rebellion was a defeat. But it wasn't meaningless. The courage they showed inspired others. The fear they struck into the hearts of the planters reshaped the colony. The story they left behind proved that the human desire for freedom can never be completely extinguished. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, it teaches us that history is complicated. The Stono Rebellion was an act of incredible bravery. It was also an act of violence that killed innocent people along with guilty ones. The rebels showed discipline and discrimination in some cases, sparing Wallace and others they deemed decent. In other cases, they killed people who may have had no direct role in their oppression. This doesn't make the rebellion wrong. It makes it human. Real people acting in real circumstances with imperfect information and overwhelming emotions. That's what history actually is. When we remember Stono, we shouldn't sanitize it. We shouldn't pretend it was a clean, simple story of good versus evil. We should remember it as what it was. A group of human beings who decided they would rather die fighting for freedom than continue living in chains. They made that choice, knowing the odds were against them. They made that choice, knowing they would probably fail. They made it anyway. That's the legacy of September 9th, 1739. That's what Jemmy and the warriors of Stono left for us. A reminder that freedom is worth fighting for. A reminder that the human spirit cannot be permanently broken. A reminder that even in the darkest times, when the oppressors seem all-powerful and the cause seems hopeless, there are people who will stand up, who will refuse, who will march toward liberty even if it means marching toward death. The drums that sounded on the King's Highway that September morning are silent now. The banner Jemmy raised has long since crumbled to dust. The voices that shouted, "Liberty!" have faded into the humid air. But the echo remains. The echo of footsteps marching toward freedom. The echo of courage that refused to be enslaved. The echo of 60 people who decided that one day of liberty was worth more than a lifetime of bondage. They didn't win, but they fought, and in the end, the fighting mattered more than the winning. Because every time someone stands up against injustice, every time someone refuses to accept that the world must be as cruel as it is, every time someone marches toward freedom even when the destination seems impossibly far away, they're walking in the footsteps of Jemmy and the warriors of Stono. The rebellion lasted one day. The memory lasts forever.